Hello, programming languages students. Welcome back to another video here. This is our first video in the, what I guess I call the Advanced Class Concepts series. So this is assuming that we've been through the basic class, we know basic classes, we know basically how to create fields, we know how to create constructors, and we know how to create methods, both mutators and accessors. And so now we're going to talk about a few extra things you can do with classes that help you solve problems that come up, right? So classes are about organizing content, and with what we know, we have a few limitations, and we're trying to learn a little more to be able to handle more situations and represent more things with classes. And so the starter code I provide for you on Moodle has three classes in it. It has a tester, a student, and an organization class. So ultimately what we're going to try to do is pretend like we're Elon, and we want to create ways to store and use students and also to organize people into organizations, right? Greek Life, Elon Society of Computing, which is a computer science club that I help run, and all sorts of different clubs and activities, things on Phoenix Connect that are useful to students here. And so to start with, we're going to work on the student class. We're going to talk about part of how the student class works now, and some weaknesses with it and some ways that we can fix it using tools that we're going to talk about. So the three really key advanced topics that I'm going to hit on here are overloading. That's where you create multiple methods with the same name but different inputs and that behave a little differently. And then we're going to talk about private versus public. When is each one appropriate? Why would you use one or the other? And what are the effects of it? And then finally, static. So static is probably the most complicated of the three major things we're going to talk about. And so I'm going to weave it in all as we go, and also spend a video talking about it probably in detail. Actually, maybe a couple videos talking about it in detail. But it is a useful tool, but it's also a very can be a very tricky tool for new programmers. So we're going to spend a lot of time on the keyword static and what that means. So to start with, we're actually going to start lightly touching on static. And we're going to also start looking at constructor overloading. So for now, I think actually this video we're just going to limit it to just creating a static field, and then we'll actually use the static field later. That way I can spend a little time discussing. So let's jump in. Let's go. Step one is create a student. So this is a little bit of review, but we're going to create a student. I'll call it student one. I don't know. Equals new student. And if we look over at our student class, we'll see that the constructor, which is just public name of the class, the constructor over here requires an integer input, which is their ID, a last name, and a first name. So let's say student one, we'll just give them an ID of 1. And then a last name of, we'll add me, I'll be student 1. Sure, so it will be Matt Feld, and then Ryan. Now I knew to put last name and then first name because if I look over here in my student class, we see last name and first name in that order. So I'm assuming that these are named in a good way that we'll be able to use them later. So hopefully this is a review. I've created a student. Excuse me, we are not yet doing anything with my student, but it is created. And so now we're going to dive into our first example of static. So I'm going to jump over to my student class. And the idea here is, when I created the student Ryan, I just decided his ID was 1. If I wanted to create another student, I could give him a new ID. Let's do Connie Book. Have Connie enrolled as a student. But now if I'm writing the student class, if this is the thing I created, I'm now completely reliant on the person using my class to provide a different ID for these students and be able to manage them differently. And so there's some risk here, right? So there's some danger if they give 2 students the same ID, then a lot of the systems on Elon would have a really hard time with this. It would probably cause a lot of problems. And so this concept of creating an ID and also not relying on whoever's using my student class to come up with smart IDs is pretty important. And so one way, not necessarily the best way, but one way to handle this is to use the keyword static, and use it specifically for a field and for kind of an ID tracker variable. So I'm going to spend just a second here talking, and then I'll actually write static. So static keyword, you'll see it in the last section in Zybook, but I'm starting with it here because it's important and it affects a lot of different things in a lot of different ways. And it's also complicated. And so as we go through, I want to try to help make it clear, because this is probably the trickiest part of this set of topics. So static. In general, when you see the keyword static, you should think belongs to the class, not to a particular object. So a static field or a static method are going to be usable and belongable to the class as a whole, not to a particular object. Okay, so if you think about it right now, every time you create a student object, they each have their own ID, their own last name, and their own first name. However, if they had a static variable, like I'm about to create, private static int next ID, I'm going to set it equal to 1,000 for now. This next ID is going to maintain its value across every object you create. And if you change it by calling a method from one object, it's going to change it for all the objects. Okay, so every object in the class will refer to this one value. Next ID is a variable that exists once. If I create 100 objects, there's still only one int next ID because it belongs to the class. It is not copied and created for every object. And so when it updates for all classes. Or sorry, for all objects in the class. So that's the important part about the keyword static here. And this is a way, not necessarily the best way, but a way to use static. And we'll show you another way when we talk about the organization class, especially when it refers to fields. So data being stored about a class. And so we're going to use this to make sure that new IDs are all different and unique. And when you create an ID or set an ID or create a student, whatever, that we have a way to do it so that the ID is always going to be different than other IDs. And so we're going to devise a system for that. And there are much better systems than what I'm going to do here, but this is a system that works. So from this first video here, we're gonna dive more into it next time, but we're going to start with just talking about a static field, which is a field that belongs to the class. And every object from the class is going to use the same variable here, right? So student 1 and student 2 have different IDs, different last names and different first names, but they're both going to point to the same, or both going to have the same next ID variable. And if one changes it, then it changes for all. So we'll explain how that can be useful here in our next video.